This was the Western Front, a muddy, brutal landscape where millions would die for mere...
The first day of the Somme is remembered as one of the most catastrophic single days in military history. Yet the story begins not with chaos, but with a plan that believed chaos could be tamed. The British High Command, confident from earlier successes on the Western Front, envisioned an offensive so carefully calculated, so rigidly structured, that it could ignore the brutal realities of modern industrial warfare. Their objective was straightforward in theory: smash the German lines, break through the entrenched front, and finally end the deadlock that had consumed the Western Front since 1914. What they failed to appreciate, however, was that their assumptions rested on illusions as fragile as the paper maps they pored over. The plan centered on the preliminary artillery barrage, which the generals assured themselves would annihilate German defenses. Weeks of shelling had been applied to the enemy lines. Each gun, each shell, was meant to carve a path through barbed wire, destroy machine gun nests, and crush the morale of the defenders. The artillery was supposed to turn the German trenches into nothing more than shallow holes in a battered field. In their minds, the calculation was perfect. Once the barrage ceased, the infantry would walk forward, unopposed, and take the second-line trenches, where the main German forces were supposedly waiting to surrender or scatter. This confidence, however, was built on a series of miscalculations and wishful thinking. The British bombardment, while intense, often failed to penetrate deep enough to destroy dugouts or cut the barbed wire effectively. German engineers had prepared for such an eventuality, reinforcing wire, deepening dugouts, and building machine gun positions that could survive even heavy shelling. These defensive measures were invisible on the maps the British generals studied. They assumed destruction where resilience had been meticulously engineered. The overconfidence of the commanders was further amplified by their faith in rigid formations. Orders were explicit. Infantrymen were to advance in waves, shoulder to shoulder, in wide columns that covered the ground methodically. They were told to walk, not run, to conserve energy for the expected assaults on the secondary trenches. The human mind might imagine discipline as a strength, but in this context, the insistence on maintaining formation turned discipline into a deadly vulnerability. Men walking in long, predictable lines became perfect targets for German machine gunners who had spent years perfecting their fields of fire. The logic of order, in a battlefield dominated by rapid-fire weapons, became the logic of slaughter. Commanders also assumed that morale would hold. They believed that the men, inspired by national pride, discipline, and the belief that their leaders had calculated every risk, would maintain formation even as bullets tore through their ranks. Yet, this belief ignored the individual experience of war. Soldiers confronted not theory, but screaming, smoke, and the relentless staccato of machine gun fire. The gap between high command assumptions and battlefield reality was not a foot or a mile it was existential. What was intended as a precise, methodical advance became a chaotic, disintegrating nightmare as waves of men were cut down before they could even reach the first-line trenches. Communication, or the lack thereof, compounded the disaster. Generals relied on outdated methods of conveying orders. Telephone lines were fragile and easily destroyed by artillery. Runners were exposed to fire and often killed before reaching their destination. There was no real-time adjustment for the unfolding carnage. Once the initial wave had left the trenches, they were committed to the assault with no practical way to alter the plan. Each subsequent wave was pushed forward because the schedule demanded it, not because the battlefield warranted it. The human cost of adhering to an inflexible plan was immense. The first day's strategy was built on assumptions that ignored human behavior under extreme stress, technological realities, and environmental factors. It assumed German troops would flee or surrender after shelling, that barbed wire would lie in broken tangles, and that the infantry's disciplined march would face minimal resistance. In reality, German machine gun crews remained alive in reinforced dugouts. Artillery failed to cut the wire in many sectors. Trenches, far from being obliterated, became fortresses from which defenders could mow down the advancing waves of soldiers. What should have been a controlled, calculated advance turned into a slaughter. Casualties mounted in minutes. The first day of the Somme saw tens of thousands of British soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. The waves of men, obedient to orders and bound by rigid formation, fell as easily as wheat before a scythe. The plan, so confident in its brilliance, collided with the unforgiving reality of industrialized warfare. Soldiers advanced toward predictable death because the strategy valued maps and calculations over observation and adaptation. Even the geography of the battlefield worsened the outcome. Muddy craters, shell-shattered earth, and lingering barbed wire turned open fields into deadly obstacles. Soldiers moving in formation had no cover and were easy targets. The Command S insistence on walking forward in line ignored the chaotic terrain that would make any orderly advance impossible. High Command could plan from a safe distance, but those in the fields experienced war as it had evolved, unmerciful, unfeeling, and mechanized. This day exposed a stark truth about World War I. Traditional military thinking, even at the highest levels, was unprepared for the new realities of combat. Cavalry charges were obsolete. Infantry waves were vulnerable. Artillery was destructive, but not omnipotent. Modern machine guns, reinforced trenches, and prepared defenses had changed the nature of war permanently. The Somme became a mirror reflecting the gap between theory and reality, between pride and practicality. The lessons of the first day are as brutal as the casualties themselves. Blind faith in rigid plans, the underestimation of the enemy, and the assumption that human lives could be treated like chess pieces created a perfect storm of disaster. British generals, confident in their maps and schedules, had underestimated the resilience of German defenses and overestimated the capability of their own artillery. They had reduced living men to numbers on a page, failing to account for the chaos of real combat. Even today, the image of soldiers walking across the muddy, shell-torn fields toward inevitable death is seared into memory. It is a testament not to individual heroism alone, but to the catastrophic consequences of leadership that mistakes obedience for adaptability, theory for reality, and hope for certainty. The first day of the Somme was not a failure of courage. It was a failure of imagination, of strategy, and of humility in the face of technological and tactical evolution. For anyone studying the First World War, the opening day of the Somme is a lesson in the dangers of overconfidence, miscalculation, and rigid command structures. It is a day where strategy and pride collided with the realities of a modern battlefield, creating a tableau of human suffering that no plan could justify. If you appreciate the depth of history and the analysis of catastrophic military errors, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, because understanding the past helps prevent repeating the same mistakes. The artillery barrage that was supposed to pave the way for the infantry at the Somme turned out to be a catastrophic illusion. British planners had envisioned the bombardment as a hammer that would crush all German defenses, leaving nothing standing in its wake. They calculated the number of shells required, the timing, and the concentration of fire with meticulous care. On paper, it was flawless. In practice, it was paper-thin thinking. More than 1.7 million shells were fired in the days leading up to the attack, but nearly a third failed to detonate. Explosive quality was inconsistent, fuses malfunctioned, and in some cases, the shells simply bounced harmlessly off the earth. The sheer volume of artillery could not compensate for its uneven effectiveness. Even the shells that did explode often fell short of their intended impact. British planners assumed that the barrages would cut the barbed wire entanglements blocking the front lines. Instead, much of the wire remained intact, twisted, and resilient, ready to snag advancing soldiers like traps laid by fate itself. Men moving across the battlefield encountered wire they believed had been destroyed, forcing them to stop, struggle, or climb, all while under relentless fire. What was supposed to be a cleared path became a deadly obstacle course. The German defensive system, carefully constructed over years, further undermined the British assumptions. Deep dugouts, reinforced with timber and earth, protected machine gunners, riflemen, and officers from the pounding shells. While the British artillery may have flattened the surface, it could not penetrate these subterranean fortresses. When the barrage lifted, the Germans emerged almost unharmed, resetting their machine guns and preparing to open fire on the approaching infantry. The British plan relied on destruction that never occurred. The enemy was not broken. He was simply waiting. The bombardment also created a psychological trap. Commanders assumed that weeks of shelling would demoralize the Germans. In reality, the defenders were psychologically reinforced by their survival. They had endured shelling before, and their dugouts allowed them to witness the destruction above without significant personal risk. Emerging after the barrage, the Germans faced advancing troops confident in their supposed superiority, yet they held all the advantages of terrain, cover, and preparation. The British soldiers who advanced believed the path was clear. The Germans knew it was a slaughter field. The misjudgment was not merely technical, it was a failure of understanding modern warfare. Artillery had changed the face of battle, but the British generals treated it as a blunt instrument rather than a tool that required precise targeting, coordination, and reconnaissance. The assumption that quantity alone could achieve quality results ignored the realities of wire, dugouts, and terrain. The bombardment was vast, but it lacked depth and nuance. It destroyed the surface of the battlefield, but the defenses that mattered remained fully functional. The result was catastrophic for the infantry. As the first waves of soldiers left the trenches, they encountered German wire that had not been cut and machine guns that had survived intact. What was meant to be a methodical advance became a slaughter. Soldiers were mown down almost immediately, trapped in no man's land by the very obstacles the artillery had failed to eliminate. The failure of the bombardment directly translated into mass casualties. Planning had assumed control over the battlefield. The reality proved otherwise. Moreover, the barrage itself created new challenges. Shell craters littered the ground, making movement difficult for soldiers in formation. Mud, churned up by millions of shells, slowed progress, disrupted the carefully timed advance, and made soldiers vulnerable targets. Where planners had imagined a cleared path, soldiers faced treacherous terrain that amplified the lethality of machine gun fire. Even those who survived the initial wire now struggled to navigate the battlefield itself. The destruction wrought by the bombardment became part of the problem, not the solution. The artillery failure also magnified the communication breakdown. British commanders assumed they could adjust attacks in real time, but the chaos of craters, wire, and heavy fire made it impossible to convey orders. Runners were killed or delayed, and signal systems were inadequate to the task. As waves of men advanced into areas where artillery had failed, they often did so without knowledge of gaps, hazards, or German positions. The failure of the barrage compounded every other flaw in planning, creating a chain reaction of disaster. Perhaps the cruelest irony of the failed bombardment was the false sense of security it gave the soldiers. Troops went over the top believing that the Germans had been softened, that resistance would be minimal, that their orders would be executable. The failure of the artillery was invisible to those advancing. Only when they reached no man's land and encountered intact wire and hidden machine guns did the reality emerge. By that point, the slaughter was inevitable. In essence, the artillery blunder at the Somme was a lesson in the dangers of assumption and overconfidence. Planners treated numbers and duration as substitutes for effectiveness. Relying on the shelling itself to achieve results that careful observation, reconnaissance, and adaptation might have accomplished more reliably. The gap between the theoretical destruction and the actual battlefield reality created the conditions for the unparalleled loss of life. On July 1, 1916, the first day of the Somme demonstrates the lethal consequences of treating technology and manpower as if they were infallible tools. 1 million shells might sound like overwhelming firepower on paper, but without precision, understanding, and realism. Sheer volume cannot replace strategy. Soldiers were sent into predictable death zones because the preliminary bombardment, which was supposed to shield them, failed to fulfill its most basic objectives. This episode also highlights the evolution of warfare and the failure of traditional command thinking. British generals, trained in previous conflicts and accustomed to linear battles, underestimated the resilience of entrenched defenders and the protective power of dugouts. They assumed the enemy could be crushed from above, rather than understanding that survival underground and deliberate. Counter-preparation could turn a barrage into a negligible threat. Every failure of the preliminary bombardment had human consequences. Soldiers advanced into uncut wire, into craters, into fields that the planners had imagined cleared. Machine guns, untouched by the shells, mowed them down in predictable arcs. Entire battalions were decimated within hours. The scale of death was directly linked to the assumptions made in command rooms far from the battlefield, assumptions that ignored engineering, terrain, and human psychology. In the end, the artillery that was supposed to protect the infantry became a haunting symbol of miscalculation. The first day of the Somme was not merely a failure of bravery or courage, it was a failure of planning, understanding, and adaptation. The shells fell in abundance but lacked the impact that could have made a difference. Men went over the top, expecting safety that never existed, walking into a trap of assumptions, calculations, and human error that no bravery could overcome. Understanding this failure is critical for comprehending the tragedy of the Somme. It illustrates that quantity cannot substitute for quality, that assumptions without verification are deadly, and that rigid adherence to a flawed plan can amplify catastrophe. The British artillery bombardment was massive in scale but catastrophic in effect, creating the perfect conditions for one of history's bloodiest single days. To grasp the full magnitude of the Somme, one must appreciate not just the courage of the soldiers, but the failure of those who directed them. The artillery, so painstakingly prepared, failed to cut wire, failed to destroy dugouts, and failed to protect the advancing infantry. The mismatch between expectation and reality defined the horror of July 1st, 1916. If you want to truly understand the lessons of military overconfidence and planning failures, and the human cost of miscalculation, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. Because analyzing mistakes from history is the only way to avoid repeating them. The first day of the Somme was not just a tragedy of men in the mud, it was a tragedy of ego. From the safety of their command posts, miles behind the front lines, generals watched their meticulously laid plans unfold, more accurately, unravel. The slaughter was immediate, visible, and total for the soldiers advancing across no man's land. But for the commanders, the reality was filtered through reports, maps, and a heavy dose of self-delusion. The remote command mentality created a dangerous separation between decision and consequence, where human life became numbers on a sheet rather than flesh and blood. Field Marshal Douglas Haig, commander of the British Expeditionary Force, embodied this problem. To understand the scale of the disconnect, imagine standing in a warm, well-lit tent 10 miles from the battlefield, studying maps and charts that describe waves of men advancing across cratered fields. You see dots, not people. You read casualty estimates that feel abstract. You trust in artillery reports that promise the German wire would be destroyed, the trenches neutralized, and resistance minimal. In Haig's mind, the plan was sound. In the field, the plan was a death sentence. Haig's stubborn adherence to outdated military doctrine amplified the carnage. Before the war, European generals were trained in cavalry and linear tactics, where speed, shock, and maneuver defined success. Officers were accustomed to seeing decisive victories unfold in days or weeks, not months, of attritional warfare. The industrialized firepower of World War I, with machine guns, deep trenches, and barbed wire, rendered these tactics obsolete. Haig, like many of his contemporaries, failed to fully grasp the implications. The rigid marching wave attacks he ordered on July 1, 1916, reflected a pre-industrial mentality: advance in formation, maintain cohesion, and trust that the enemy would be overwhelmed by numbers and discipline. Reports from the front lines, which described shattered units and mounting casualties, often never reached Haig and Timor. When they did, they were dismissed as exaggerations. The generals operated under the assumption that men could endure almost any level of punishment if they remained disciplined. Survivors' accounts were written off as anecdotal, the horror filtered through a lens of incredulity. There was an almost institutional disbelief. The idea that 19,000 soldiers could be killed in a single day seemed impossible, despite the mounting evidence. The detachment of the high command created a feedback loop of deadly overconfidence. From miles away, maps do not bleed. From miles away, men are statistics. Field reports that contradicted the general's expectations were treated as anomalies, miscommunication, or incompetence on the part of lower officers. Haig's ego, reinforced by prior successes in smaller-scale engagements and victories over less entrenched enemies, made him confident in the strategy, even as the battlefield itself screamed for adaptation. The remote command mentality insulated him from reality. The psychological dimension of this ego cannot be overstated. Generals like Haig were products of a system that rewarded hierarchy and unquestioned obedience. Commanders rarely experienced the battlefield firsthand once war became industrialized. Their legitimacy rested on planning, training, and authority, not personal exposure to risk. In this context, acknowledging failure was not merely tactical, it was a threat to personal honor and career survival. Haig's reputation and sense of self were intertwined with his belief in the plan. To admit that the first day had gone catastrophically wrong was to admit personal error on a scale that his worldview could not accommodate. This ego-driven blindness had concrete effects on the conduct of the battle. Requests to adjust timing, alter attack vectors, or pause the advance to account for uncut wire and intact machine guns were often ignored or delayed. Haig trusted in the original orders and in his own judgment more than in real-time intelligence. Units continued to advance in rigid waves across cratered minefields, even as adjacent formations were decimated. The commander's inability or refusal to recalibrate the plan in response to unfolding disaster multiplied casualties. The reliance on cavalriera thinking exacerbated the tragedy. In the years before 1914, military success was measured by mobility, rapid decision-making, and decisive strikes. The Somme demanded attrition, coordination with artillery, and an understanding of entrenched defense. Haig and his peers were ill-equipped to adjust. They treated the battlefield as if it were still the open plains of Europe, not a muddy hell filled with machine guns and barbed wire. Men advancing over no-man's land were viewed through the lens of outdated theory. Formations must be maintained. Momentum cannot be sacrificed, and the enemy will crumble under sheer will and number. Another aspect of the ego at play was the stubborn belief in personal vision over collective reality. Haig had crafted the Somme plan based on assumptions about artillery effectiveness, infantry discipline, and enemy fragility. To admit these assumptions were wrong would be to admit that his vision, and by extension his judgment, had failed. In a culture that revered decisive leadership, failure was a personal and professional humiliation. Generals preferred to trust their plan, their preparation, and their own intellect rather than the terrifying, chaotic, and contradictory reports coming from the front lines. The consequences of this detached, ego-driven command were staggering. Casualties on the first day totaled roughly 57,000 British soldiers, with nearly 20,000 dead. These numbers alone are almost incomprehensible, but they gain clarity when contrasted with the general's physical and emotional distance from the field. The decisions were made in comfort. The consequences suffered by those who could neither influence nor escape the outcome. Men were walking into a slaughter orchestrated by individuals for whom human life had become abstract. The blind spot created by ego also had lasting effects on British military culture. The disconnect between command and execution, the inability to admit or correct failure, and the insistence on adhering to flawed strategy created patterns that persisted throughout the war. Battles continued to reflect this dynamic: high casualties, rigid orders, and slow adaptation to the realities of modern warfare. Haig and his contemporaries became symbols of the deadly cost of hierarchical pride and detachment. Understanding the general's ego is key to understanding why the Somme became a tragedy of systemic proportions. It was not just bad luck, not just poor tactics, but the combination of industrialized firepower and an inflexible, self-assured command structure that allowed disaster to unfold on such a scale. The human cost the waves of soldiers mown down as they followed orders was a direct consequence of leadership convinced of its own infallibility, insulated from feedback, and blinded by pride. Ego also shaped narrative and memory. After the battle, Haig and other senior commanders defended their actions vigorously. The idea that they had made mistakes on such a scale was politically and socially unpalatable. Reports were sanitized, blame was shifted to junior officers, and public discourse often focused on bravery rather than on the catastrophic failures of strategy. The distance of command allowed generals to survive reputationally, while soldiers paid with their lives. The first day of the Somme is therefore a study in how extreme ego can magnify disaster. When commanders believe in the absolute correctness of their vision, when they are physically and psychologically removed from the consequences, and when they dismiss evidence that contradicts their preconceptions, the results are catastrophic. The tragedy is not only in the numbers killed, but in the systemic failure that allowed human error and pride to dictate the fate of tens of thousands. If you want to fully grasp how leadership, failure, ego, and distance can turn strategy into slaughter, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. Analyzing the mistakes of the past helps prevent future catastrophes. The first day of the Somme is often remembered for the staggering numbers, but understanding the human cost goes far beyond statistics. On July 1, 1916, Britain suffered 57,470 casualties in just 24 hours. Of these, 19,240 were dead. These numbers alone make the day the single bloodiest in the history of the British Army. But the real horror lies not just in the totals, but in how the system, the organization, the command structure, and the logistics completely failed the men who were sent to their deaths. Imagine standing on the front line at 7:30 a.m., following orders from generals who are 10 miles away, safe and insulated from the reality of the battlefield. The preliminary artillery barrage had lifted, and you were expected to walk calmly across no man's land. The ground is pockmarked with shell craters, tangled in barbed wire that wasn't completely cut. Machine guns hidden in deep German trenches open fire the moment the first wave appears. Men drop in front of you, behind you, to the left and right. The sound is deafening, the air thick with smoke, dirt, and the metallic temps of blood. Every step forward is a calculated risk, yet the pace is dictated not by survival, but by the rigid orders of distant command. The casualties began almost immediately. The artillery that was supposed to neutralize the German defenses had failed. Shells didn't explode, or they were too shallow to destroy the wire. German soldiers, protected in deep dugouts, emerged to mow down the advancing waves of British infantry. The rate of loss was staggering, 2 casualties every 3 seconds across the front. Medics and stretcher bearers, already unprepared for this scale of carnage, were immediately overwhelmed. The wounded lay exposed, crying out for help that could not come. Field hospitals were swamped before the morning ended, tents overrun and supplies exhausted. The battlefield itself became a chaotic, unmanageable scene of human suffering. The communication breakdown compounded the disaster. Orders from headquarters took hours to reach the front, and reports of the unfolding catastrophe were delayed, garbled, or filtered through optimistic assumptions. Soldiers on the ground often received no guidance beyond the original marching orders. Units became isolated as waves of men were cut down in the open fields. Commanders assumed formations were still intact when, in reality, companies had been decimated, officers killed, and survivors scattered across cratered terrain. The chain of command at the front collapsed in many sectors, leaving soldiers to make impossible decisions on their own. The psychological toll of this chaos cannot be overstated. Men were not only facing the constant threat of death, but were also witnessing the annihilation of friends, comrades, and superiors. Entire units were reduced to a fraction of their original strength before reaching the German front line. The survivors were physically exhausted and emotionally shattered. Letters written afterward, diaries, and memoirs describe a sense of disbelief, horror, and numbing despair. Some soldiers froze under fire, others advanced mechanically, driven by training, peer pressure, or sheer instinct. Medical services, unprepared for the scale of disaster, struggled to cope. Field ambulances were delayed by mud, shell craters, and ongoing fire. Casualties often lay for hours before receiving basic treatment. Infections spread rapidly, and many men who could have survived immediate wounds succumbed to blood loss, gangrene, or exposure. The logistical failure of evacuation and medical support turned what could have been survivable injuries into death sentences. The battlefield was not just a scene of combat. It was a chaotic, unmanageable environment where human systems were insufficient to deal with industrialized killing. The scale of the disaster also exposed the limitations of pre-war planning. Military theorists had not anticipated the combination of modern artillery, machine guns, barbed wire, and massed infantry attacks. The rigid, linear tactics designed for maneuver warfare in open fields clashed catastrophically with the static, entrenched nature of the Western Front. Soldiers were trained to follow orders and maintain formation. Yet the terrain, the weaponry, and the relentless firepower made those formations almost suicidal. The general's plans, conceived on maps and paper, collided brutally with reality. Individual acts of heroism occurred throughout the chaos. Soldiers attempted to rescue wounded comrades, carry messages, or breach sections of wire under fire. Some small units managed to reach enemy trenches, only to be cut down in subsequent waves. These isolated successes were quickly erased by the overwhelming tide of casualties and the inflexibility of the plan. Heroism on this day was measured not by strategic gains, but by survival and the ability to act amidst total chaos. The psychological impact extended beyond the front lines. Families at home waited for news, often receiving only vague reports or casualty lists that could not convey the scale of suffering. Newspapers tried to maintain morale, but could not disguise the enormity of the disaster. The sense of national shock was profound. Britain had entered a war, believing in limited, decisive battles. The reality of industrialized slaughter shattered any such illusions. The first day of the Somme became a symbol of the human cost of modern warfare, a warning that preparation and planning had limits when confronted with mechanized killing. The battlefield itself bore witness to the human cost. Cratered fields, thousands of bodies, and scattered equipment created a landscape of horror. Soldiers, personal belongings, letters, and identification tags littered the ground. The sheer scale of death was almost unimaginable. Contemporary accounts describe the difficulty in burying the dead, the stench of decomposing bodies in summer heat, and the emotional breakdown of soldiers who had survived the initial waves. The land itself became a monument to human suffering, a tangible record of failure, misjudgment, and extreme human vulnerability. The failure of the system also highlighted the limits of technology in war. Artillery, intended to soften enemy defenses, proved unreliable. Communication systems were inadequate for the scale of engagement. Logistics could not keep up with casualty evacuation. The human body remained fragile in the face of machine firepower. The first day of the Somme demonstrated that industrialized warfare required not just firepower, but flexible command, realistic planning, and immediate adaptation absent in July 1916. Beyond the tactical and logistical failures, the human dimension revealed systemic flaws in leadership culture. Commanders were trained to maintain authority, uphold the plan, and trust their assumptions. They were rarely encouraged to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. The culture of obedience and the distance between command and execution meant that men were sent forward without the guidance or support necessary to survive. Ego, rigidity, and outdated doctrine combined to produce a scenario in which human cost was maximized. The lessons of the human cost extend beyond numbers. They underscore the consequences of failing to match strategy to reality, of ignoring frontline feedback, and of allowing hierarchical pride to outweigh empathy and common sense. Soldiers were treated as instruments of policy, expendable components of a larger plan that did not account for individual life or immediate risk. The first day of the Somme remains a stark reminder that leadership mistakes in industrialized warfare translate directly into unprecedented human suffering. The first day also changed the way Britain and the world perceived modern war. The slaughter shocked the public, influenced future military tactics, and became a cultural touchstone. Memorials, diaries, literature, and historical analysis all reflect the scale of human loss. The men who survived carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Families and communities were left to grapple with the enormity of the deaths, shaping memory and identity for generations. The first day of the Somme demonstrates that human cost is not merely a statistic, it is the lived reality of chaos, fear, and systemic failure. Every number represents a person, every formation, a story, every crater, a scene of unspeakable suffering. Understanding this day is crucial to understanding the modern human experience of war, the consequences of ego-driven command, and the terrifying reality of industrialized killing. If you want to fully grasp how leadership, logistics, and industrialized firepower combine to create a day of unprecedented disaster, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. Studying these mistakes honors the memory of those lost and teaches lessons that extend far beyond the battlefield. The first day of the Somme did not occur in isolation. It was a continuation of a pattern established in the early years of World War I. A brutal dance of traditional tactics against modern technology across the Western Front. Generals clung to pre-war doctrines, confident that disciplined massed infantry assaults could still prevail against entrenched machine guns and artillery. The Somme exposed the fatal flaw in this thinking. Soldiers were sent in waves, obediently advancing over open ground. While the enemy's firepower, far more lethal and concentrated than in previous conflicts, cut them down systematically. The sheer scale of the failure is staggering. On July 1, 1916, over 57,000 men became casualties in a single day, a number almost unimaginable in previous wars. Yet despite these losses, the command continued to employ the same methods on subsequent days. The lessons were clear to those on the ground. The trenches were nearly impregnable. Wire could not be reliably destroyed by artillery, and machine guns were devastating against exposed troops. However, the generals in command, operating from the safety of rear positions, clung to their rigid plans. Each wave of men was treated as an expendable tool, a continuation of a calculation that valued adherence to doctrine over human life. This repeated stupidity was not just a matter of mismanagement, it was a structural problem. Communication from the front to headquarters was slow and unreliable. Reports of casualties and battlefield conditions often lagged hours or even days behind reality. Commanders relied on maps, models, and optimistic assumptions rather than the accounts of those experiencing the horror firsthand. When the first wave failed, the next was ordered forward without modification. When the next failed, the following one was sent. There was no pause to reassess, no adjustment to tactics that acknowledged the devastating new reality of industrialized warfare. The Somme was also emblematic of a larger strategic miscalculation. Allied High Command aimed to relieve pressure on the French forces at Verdun and hoped to bleed the German army through attrition. While the intention might have seemed logical on paper, the execution ignored practical realities. The Western Front was a static, attritional battlefield, where every inch gained required immense expenditure of life and material. Sending men into predictable death traps under the illusion of progress was a policy doomed from the start. The psychological impact on both soldiers and commanders cannot be overstated. Men in the trenches quickly realized that obedience often meant certain death. Survival depended not on heroism or tactical skill, but on luck, timing, and the luck of being in the right place when enemy fire opened. The constant exposure to relentless artillery and machine gun fire left deep emotional scars. Fear, panic, and trauma became ubiquitous, shaping the character of the soldiers who survived. Yet for the generals behind the lines, these human realities were abstract numbers, often reduced to casualty lists on paper, stripped of the flesh and blood context. The rigidity of command was mirrored in logistical failures. Medical services were overwhelmed from the first hours. Casualties could not be evacuated quickly enough, leaving men to suffer on the battlefield for hours or even days. Field hospitals were inundated, supplies ran low, and stretcher bearers could not navigate the cratered landscape under fire. Communication systems failed to adapt to the scale of the disaster, creating confusion and mismanagement. The human cost of these logistical failures compounded the tactical errors, ensuring that many deaths were not inevitable in combat, but were the result of preventable systemic breakdowns. In examining the Somme, one sees a tragic intersection of ego, tradition, and the brutal efficiency of modern warfare. Commanders like Field Marshal Haig adhered to pre-war notions of honor, discipline, and orderly advance, often at the expense of adaptability. Their pride and belief in the invincibility of their methods blinded them to the lessons unfolding before their eyes. The result was not merely high casualties. It was a systemic failure to recognize reality and adjust accordingly. Each dead soldier was both a personal tragedy and a reflection of institutional stubbornness. The Somme also illustrates the dangers of planning divorced from human experience. Maps, artillery charts, and theoretical models provided an illusion of control. Yet the battlefield was a dynamic environment shaped by chaos, weather, terrain, and enemy innovation. Rigid adherence to plans that assumed ideal conditions led to predictable carnage. Soldiers were treated as variables to be calculated rather than humans to be led. Orders emphasized formation and timing over individual initiative, further constraining those on the front lines. The war became a machine of death, fueled by calculation but blind to context. The legacy of the Somme reverberated far beyond its immediate battlefield. It became a symbol of wasted lives, the consequences of inflexible leadership, and the horrors of modern industrialized warfare. Military theorists and historians would reference the Somme as a cautionary tale for decades, illustrating how failure to adapt to technological change in battlefield reality leads to catastrophic loss. The lessons ignored in 1916 echoed in subsequent conflicts, where rigid command structures continued to clash with new weapons and methods. The Somme also reveals the human cost of social and cultural structures in the military. Officers were predominantly drawn from social classes that valued tradition, hierarchy, and personal prestige. Their decisions were influenced as much by ego, reputation, and social expectations as by strategic necessity. The common soldier, often from working-class backgrounds, bore the full brunt of these decisions, highlighting the asymmetry of power and vulnerability in wartime. Courage, obedience, and discipline became instruments of survival, yet the overarching system valued loyalty to doctrine over the preservation of life. The first day's failures were amplified by the nature of industrialized warfare. The combination of modern artillery, rapid-fire machine guns, and entrenched defenses created a battlefield environment previously unimaginable. Traditional tactics, designed for maneuver warfare in open fields, were rendered obsolete almost overnight. Yet commanders, steeped in pre-war training and social expectations, refused to adjust. The tragedy of the Somme was not just in the lives lost, but in the demonstration that human institutions often lag disastrously behind technological realities, with catastrophic consequences. Moreover, the Somme illustrates the systemic inertia that afflicts large organizations in crisis. Even as casualties mounted, plans continued without substantial modification. Communication failures, rigid command structures, and a cultural emphasis on obedience ensured that errors were repeated day after day. The battlefield became a feedback system that could not self-correct, where each wave of men functioned as a grim experiment in attrition, testing theories that had already been proven deadly. In the end, the first day of the Somme exemplifies the danger of learning nothing from the past. It was a continuation of patterns seen in earlier battles on the Western Front, where optimism, ego, and tradition overrode empirical evidence and human experience. The massed assaults, reliance on flawed artillery assumptions, and dismissal of frontline intelligence were mistakes made repeatedly with predictable and catastrophic results. The cost was immense, tens of thousands of dead, shattered lives, and an enduring symbol of the failure of leadership under industrialized warfare. The Somme became a lasting lesson in the importance of adaptability, human-centered planning, and the recognition that technology can fundamentally alter the rules of engagement. The tragedy lay not only in the deaths themselves, but in the systemic causes: ego-driven command, inflexible doctrine, and a persistent refusal to see reality as it was. The Western Front, and particularly the first day of the Somme, remains a stark reminder that military genius is measured not by plans drawn on maps, but by the capacity to adapt, preserve life, and respond to the unforgiving nature of modern war. For those studying the Somme, the ultimate lesson is clear. Failure to learn from the past ensures the repetition of history's worst mistakes. The first day of the Somme stands as a monument to human error, systemic rigidity, and the staggering human cost of industrialized warfare. Each statistic, each crater, and each grave tells a story of leadership that ignored reality. Soldiers who faced unimaginable odds and a system that failed its people. To understand the Somme is to understand the full consequences of inflexible leadership, outdated tactics, and human suffering magnified by industrial power. It is a story that must be remembered, studied, and internalized not just as history, but as a warning for all who seek to wield power over life and death in contexts where technology and human behavior intersect. If you want to delve deeper into the catastrophic lessons of leadership and strategy, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. Learning from the Somme is a tribute to the lives lost and a necessary guide to preventing future repetition of such preventable human tragedies.